Alara adjusted her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles widening as the sprawling forest stretched endlessly before her. The winding road seemed like it had been forgotten by time, the dense canopy of trees overhead casting long, shifting shadows. The air grew colder as she approached her destination, the estate that now, inexplicably, belonged to her. She barely knew her cousin Lyra. Family reunions were rare and strained, but the news of her sudden death had hit harder than expected. And now this, an inheritance letter, summoning her to the middle of nowhere to claim her legacy. The mansion loomed in the distance, its silhouette stark against the gray sky. It was larger than she had imagined, its Gothic spires and stone walls shrouded in mist. Alara parked her car near the front steps, her heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and unease. She stepped out, the cool forest air biting at her skin. The place felt alive in a way she couldn't quite explain, as though it were watching her. She climbed the stone steps, her heels clicking softly, and pushed open the heavy oak door. The air inside was warmer but carried a weight, a stillness that settled in her chest. The foyer was grand yet somber, with high ceilings and intricate woodwork. Her eyes were drawn to the large fireplace on the far wall, where a figure stood waiting. He was tall, impossibly so, his frame filling the room with an intimidating presence. His hair was a dark mess, wild and untamed, falling just past his sharp jawline. His eyes, golden and fierce, locked onto hers the moment she entered. But it wasn't just his eyes or his height that set him apart. It was the subtle, unmistakable signs of his otherness. His ears were slightly pointed, and his hands, resting at his sides, ended in claws rather than nails. His stance radiated controlled power, like a predator assessing whether to pounce. "You're a Lara," he said, his voice a low, rumbling growl that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't a question. He already knew. "And you must be Kale," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Lyra's husband." Kale's lips twitched into a semblance of a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You could call me that." Alara's heart thudded in her chest as she took a hesitant step forward. "I don't understand. Why am I here? Why would she leave all of this to me?" Kale's gaze didn't waver. "Lyra knew her time was short. She chose you to take her place." "Her place," Alara repeated, confused. "I don't." Kale crossed the room in two long strides, his sheer size making her feel small. He stopped just a breath away, towering over her. The air between them felt charged, and Alara had to tilt her head to meet his gaze. "This estate," Kale said slowly, "and everything within it, including me, are bound by an ancient pact. When Lyra died, that bond didn't break, it transferred. To you." Alara's pulse quickened. "You mean you're part of the inheritance?" Kale's golden eyes darkened. "Yes, I'm bound to serve and protect the heir of this estate. That heir is now you." Alara swallowed hard, her mind racing. "I didn't ask for this." "Neither did I," Kale replied, his tone sharp but not unkind. "But here we are." The tension between them was thick, an undercurrent of something more primal beneath their words. Alara felt heat rise to her cheeks and quickly looked away, her gaze falling on the crackling fireplace. She needed a moment to collect herself, to process what he was saying. "Why did Lyra keep this a secret?" she asked finally, her voice softer. Kale hesitated, his expression flickering with something akin to sorrow. "Lyra wanted to protect you from this world. From me. But in the end, she knew you were strong enough to handle it." Alara's stomach churned. "Handle what? You make it sound like I'm in danger." Kale's jaw clenched, and he stepped back, giving her space. "You are. The council won't accept you as the new heir. They'll come for me, and when they do, they'll come for you too." Alara's breath caught. "What council? Who are they?" Kale's eyes flashed. "The ruling body of my kind. They don't like humans interfering in our affairs. Lyra was an exception, but you're untested." The weight of his words settled over her, but Alara felt a spark of defiance. She wasn't one to back down from a challenge, even one as surreal as this. Then we'll make them see I'm not someone to be dismissed. Kale raised a brow, clearly surprised by her resolve. You're bold. That might keep you alive. The corner of Alara's mouth twitched, though her nerves were far from settled. I don't plan on dying anytime soon. Kale gave a short, approving nod. Good. You'll need that fire. A silence fell between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Alara's eyes drifted back to Kale, and she found herself studying him more closely. His broad shoulders, the way his muscles shifted beneath his shirt, the hint of sharp canines when he spoke. There was a raw, almost dangerous beauty to him, and it both unnerved and intrigued her. Kale seemed to notice her lingering gaze. His lips curved slightly, this time with a hint of genuine amusement. You should get some rest, he said, his voice softer now. Tomorrow, things will get more complicated. Alara nodded, though her mind was far from restful. She turned toward the grand staircase, her steps hesitant. Before she reached the first step, she glanced back at Kale. Thank you, she said quietly, for telling me the truth. Kale's expression softened, just for a moment. You're welcome. As Alara climbed the stairs, her heart still racing, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had changed irrevocably. She had inherited more than a mansion and a guardian. She had inherited a destiny she barely understood. And with it came Kale, the beast who now stood by her side, his golden eyes watching her every move. Alara didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. She wasn't alone anymore. The early morning light streamed through the tall windows of the mansion, casting golden beams across the wooden floors. Alara stood in the study, her eyes scanning the walls lined with shelves full of old, leather-bound books. Some titles were in languages she couldn't recognize, their spines marked with strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly under the sunlight. She traced her fingers over them, feeling an odd warmth beneath her touch. Kale entered quietly, his presence immediately filling the room. Alara turned to see him leaning against the doorframe, his golden eyes watching her with a guarded intensity. Even at rest, his posture exuded a quiet power, his arms crossed over his broad chest. Do you always skulk around like that? She asked, forcing a light tone to cut through the tension that seemed ever present between them. Kale's lips curved into a faint smirk. I wasn't skulking. You're just easily startled. Alara raised an eyebrow, but didn't rise to the bait. What is all this? She asked, gesturing to the shelves. These books don't look like anything you'd find in a normal library. They aren't, Kale said, stepping further into the room. They're records of the pact, histories of my kind. Lyra spent years studying them, trying to understand the bond between us. Alara's gaze flickered to the books again. And did she? Kale shrugged, his expression darkening. Enough to keep the council at bay, for a time. But knowledge alone won't protect you. The weight of his words settled over her, but Alara squared her shoulders. Then tell me what will. Kale's eyes narrowed slightly, as though measuring her resolve. Strength, resilience, and a willingness to fight for what's yours. Alara's pulse quickened. I'm willing. He studied her for a long moment before nodding. Then let's begin. Kale led her to a secluded part of the estate, a wide courtyard bordered by high stone walls. The air here was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of pine. In the center of the courtyard, a training area had been set up, complete with wooden dummies and weapon racks. Alara looked around, her brows lifting. You're seriously expecting me to fight? Kale stepped into the center of the courtyard, his movements fluid and predatory. I'm expecting you to survive. Fighting is part of that. Alara sighed but nodded, stepping forward. Fine. Show me what to do. Kale closed the distance between them, his towering form casting a shadow over her. He reached out, his hands brushing lightly over her shoulders, adjusting her stance. His touch was firm but not harsh, and Alara was acutely aware of the heat radiating from him. Keep your feet planted, Kale instructed, his voice low. You need balance before anything else. Alara tried to focus on his words rather than the way his hands lingered a moment longer than necessary. She shifted her weight as he guided her, his touch sliding down her arms to position her hands correctly. Good, he murmured, stepping back. Now throw a punch. Alara hesitated, then thrust her fist forward. Kale caught it easily, his hand enveloping hers. Not bad, he said, his tone laced with a hint of amusement. But you're holding back. Again. She scowled and tried again, putting more force behind emotion. This time, Kale nodded approvingly. Better. Don't be afraid to hit hard. You won't hurt me. Alara couldn't help but smile at the challenge in his voice. We'll see about that. They continued for what felt like hours, Kale patiently correcting her form and teaching her basic techniques. As the morning wore on, Alara found herself growing more confident. She even managed to land a solid hit on one of the training dummies, earning a rare grin from Kale. But it wasn't just the training that left her breathless. Each time Kale touched her, whether to adjust her stance or guide her movements, her skin seemed to tingle under his fingers. There was an undeniable electricity between them, a tension that neither of them acknowledged aloud but both seemed to feel. Finally, Kale called for a break. Alara collapsed onto a nearby bench, wiping sweat from her brow. Kale stood a few feet away, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. You did well, he said after a moment, his voice softer than before. Alara looked up at him, surprised by the praise. Thanks. I think. Kale's lips twitched into a faint smile. You have more fight in you than you realize. Alara felt a surge of pride at his words. She wasn't used to being seen as strong, but Kale looked at her as though she were capable of more than she had ever imagined. Why do you care so much? She asked suddenly, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Why are you helping me? Kale's expression shifted, a flicker of something unspoken crossing his face. He stepped closer, his golden eyes locking onto hers. Because I'm bound to you, he said, his voice low but firm. But also because I want you to succeed. You're in this now, whether you like it or not. Alara's breath hitched as he knelt in front of her, his presence overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the raw power barely contained beneath his skin. Kale reached out, his hand brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his clawed fingers barely grazing her skin. You're stronger than you think, Alara, he said softly, and I'll be here to remind you of that. Always. Alara's chest tightened at the sincerity in his voice. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, her eyes never leaving his. For a moment, they stayed like that, the world around them fading away. Kale stood, his hand lingering on her cheek for just a second longer before he pulled back. Rest, he said, his voice returning to its usual commanding tone. We'll continue later. Alara watched him walk away, her mind racing. She had come here expecting to inherit a house, maybe some old family heirlooms. Instead, she had found herself bound to a creature unlike any she had ever known, a protector, a teacher, and perhaps something more. As Kale disappeared into the shadows of the mansion, Alara felt a strange sense of anticipation. The road ahead was uncertain, but she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The estate was eerily quiet that evening, the stillness broken only by the occasional crackle of the fireplace. Alara sat curled up in one of the grand armchairs in the library, a thick, leather-bound book resting on her lap. She had spent the last few hours delving into the mansion's hidden history, hoping to uncover more about the pact that bound her and Kale. The words were dense, filled with arcane symbols and cryptic passages, but she was determined to understand. Her eyes burned from the strain of reading, but she pushed on, flipping another page. A sketch of a wolf-like figure caught her attention, its form towering and powerful, much like Kale's when he transformed. Beneath it was a passage detailing the bond between a shifter and their human heir. The language hinted at a deep, almost spiritual connection, one forged through trust, loyalty, and something more intimate. The text danced around the implications, but never fully explained them. Alara's thoughts drifted to Kale. He had been distant since their training earlier, retreating to his quarters without a word. She couldn't shake the memory of his touch, the way his fingers had lingered on her skin, or the intensity in his eyes when he spoke to her. There was a weight to their bond, something unspoken yet undeniable. As if summoned by her thoughts, the library door creaked open, and Kale stepped inside. His presence filled the room instantly, his golden eyes catching the firelight. He looked different in the soft glow, less guarded, more vulnerable. He carried a quiet strength, but tonight, there was something else in his gaze, something that made Alara's heart skip. Still reading, he asked, his voice a low rumble. Alara nodded, closing the book but keeping her hand on its cover. Trying to understand what exactly I've gotten myself into. Kale crossed the room, his movements fluid and predatory. He stopped beside her chair, glancing down at the book. Find anything useful? Maybe, Alara said, tilting her head to meet his gaze. It talks about the bond between us, how it's more than just protection. Kale's jaw tightened, and he looked away for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. The bond is complicated, he said finally. It's not just about duty, it's about connection. Alara's chest tightened at his words. And what does that mean for us? Kale's eyes softened as they returned to hers. He knelt beside her chair, bringing them to the same level. His hand reached out, brushing against hers where it rested on the book. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a spark through her. It means we're tied to each other, he said quietly, in ways neither of us fully understands yet. Alara's breath hitched as his fingers lingered on hers. The space between them seemed to shrink, the air charged with an unspoken tension. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the steady rhythm of his breathing matching her own. Kale, she began, but her voice faltered. He leaned in slightly, his golden eyes never leaving hers. Tell me to stop, and I will. Alara's heart raced, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. But she didn't want him to stop. She didn't want the distance between them anymore. Slowly, she shook her head. Kale's hand moved to her cheek, his touch warm and grounding. He leaned in further, his face inches from hers. The world seemed to fade around them, leaving only the crackle of the fire and the sound of their breaths. When his lips finally brushed against hers, it was soft, almost tentative, as though testing the waters. Alara responded instinctively, leaning into the kiss. It deepened, growing more passionate as Kale's other hand slipped around her waist, pulling her closer. Her fingers found their way into his hair, tangling in the dark strands as she lost herself in the moment. Time seemed to stand still as they explored each other, their bond solidifying in a way words never could. Kale's touch was both gentle and firm, his movements deliberate as though memorizing every curve of her. Alara felt safe in his arms, yet there was an underlying current of raw energy, a reminder of the beast within him. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. Kale's eyes searched hers, his expression a mix of longing and restraint. This changes things, he murmured. Alara nodded, her fingers still tangled in his hair. I know. Kale cupped her face, his thumb brushing lightly over her cheek. We'll have to be careful. The council will use anything they can to weaken us. Alara's resolve hardened. Then we'll give them nothing to use. Kale smiled, a rare softness in his expression. You're stronger than you think. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. Come. There's something you need to see. Curious, Alara followed him out of the library and through the winding halls of the mansion. He led her to a hidden staircase, its stone steps descending into the depths of the estate. The air grew cooler as they went, the faint sound of water echoing off the walls. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a cavernous chamber. In its center was a pool of shimmering water, glowing faintly in the dim light. Symbols like those in the books were etched into the surrounding stone, pulsing softly in rhythm with the water's glow. This is the heart of the estate, Kale explained, the source of the pack's power. Alara stepped closer, mesmerized by the pool. It's beautiful. Kale nodded, his eyes fixed on the water. It's also dangerous. The council will want to control it, and through it, us. Alara's hand brushed against his arm. Then we won't let them. Kale turned to her, his expression serious. To protect this place and each other, we'll need to be stronger than ever. Alara met his gaze, her determination matching his. We will be. Kale's hand covered hers, their bond solidifying further with that simple touch. Together, they stood before the glowing pool, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The days following their shared moment in the library passed in a blur of preparation. Kale intensified Alara's training, pushing her to hone both her physical strength and her instincts. The looming threat of the council weighed heavily on them, but Alara found herself growing more confident with each passing day. She wasn't just learning to defend herself, she was learning to stand her ground in a world that had once seemed overwhelming. One morning, Kale led her to a secluded area of the forest surrounding the estate. The trees here were ancient, their thick trunks twisted with age. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. In the center of the clearing stood a weathered stone altar, its surface etched with more of the strange symbols Alara had come to recognize. This place was a sanctuary for Lyra, Kale said, his voice low. It's where she came to strengthen her connection to the pact. Alara ran her fingers over the cold stone, the symbols tingling beneath her touch. What do I need to do? Kale stepped closer, his presence grounding. You need to focus. Feel the energy around you. Let it flow through you. The bond between us will guide you. Alara nodded, taking a deep breath. She closed her eyes and let herself tune into the forest's rhythm, the rustling leaves, the distant chirping of birds, the steady hum of life. Slowly, she became aware of a faint pulse beneath her feet, as if the very earth was alive. It matched the rhythm of her heartbeat, steady and unyielding. Kale's hand brushed against hers, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her. Good, he murmured. Now focus on the bond. Alara concentrated, her mind reaching for the connection she felt with Kale. It was like a thread of light, strong yet delicate, weaving between them. As she focused, the thread seemed to thrum with energy, growing brighter and more tangible. Suddenly, the symbols on the altar began to glow, their light spreading outward like ripples on water. Alara felt a surge of power rush through her, leaving her breathless. She opened her eyes to find Kale watching her, his golden gaze filled with both pride and something deeper. You're stronger than I expected, he said, his voice tinged with admiration. Alara smiled, though her heart was still racing. I had a good teacher. Kale's lips twitched, but before he could respond, his expression shifted. He straightened, his gaze sharpening as his ears twitched slightly. We're not alone, he said, his tone deadly serious. Alara tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the dagger she had started carrying. Where? Kale tilted his head, listening intently. Northwest. 3, maybe 4 intruders. Alara nodded, her pulse quickening. She followed Kale as he moved swiftly through the forest, his steps silent despite his size. They stopped near a dense thicket, where Kale motioned for her to stay low. He crouched beside her, his eyes scanning the area. Moments later, the sound of voices drifted through the trees. Alara's heart pounded as she caught sight of 3 figures moving cautiously through the forest. They were shifters, their predatory grace unmistakable. Each of them carried weapons, their expressions tense and focused. They're scouts, Kale whispered, sent by the council to test our defenses. Alara tightened her grip on the dagger. What do we do? Kale's gaze flicked to her, his expression unreadable. We show them that we're not easy prey. Before she could respond, Kale stepped out from their hiding place, his presence immediately drawing the attention of the intruders. The scouts froze, their eyes widening as Kale shifted slightly, his features taking on more of his beastly form. His claws elongated, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. This is private land, Kale said, his voice cold and commanding. You're trespassing. One of the scouts, a lean man with sharp features, stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. We're here under the authority of the council, he said, his tone measured but firm. We've come to ensure the estate remains under proper control. Kale bared his teeth in a snarl. The estate is under my protection. Leave now. The tension in the clearing was palpable. The scouts exchanged wary glances, clearly unsettled by Kale's presence. But the leader didn't back down. We have orders, he said, his voice hardening. We won't leave without ensuring that the air. Before he could finish, Kale lunged forward, closing the distance between them in an instant. He stopped just short of the scout, his claws hovering near the man's throat. The scout froze, his eyes wide with fear. The air is under my protection, Kale growled. You've seen enough. Leave while you still can. The scout swallowed hard, his confidence visibly shaken. He nodded slowly, signaling to the others. Without another word, the three shifters retreated, their movements hurried. Kale watched them go, his body tense until they were out of sight. Only then did he relax, his claws retracting as he turned back to Alara. They'll report back to the council, he said grimly. This was just the beginning. Alara stepped forward, her expression resolute. Then we'll be ready for whatever comes next. Kale's eyes softened slightly, and he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face. You've come a long way, Alara, but there's still more to learn. Alara nodded, her determination unwavering. Then teach me. Kale's lips curved into a faint smile, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. We'll face this together. As they made their way back to the estate, Alara felt a newfound sense of purpose. The bond between her and Kale was growing stronger, and with it, her confidence. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it head on, with Kale by her side. The storm came suddenly, sweeping across the estate with howling winds and sheets of rain. Thunder rumbled in the distance, shaking the windows of the mansion as lightning streaked across the sky. Alara stood at one of the tall windows in the main hall, watching the storm rage outside. The world beyond the glass was a blur of movement and sound, a chaotic reflection of the turmoil brewing within her. She couldn't shake the tension that had settled in her chest since the encounter with the scouts. The council's presence loomed over them like a dark cloud, and despite her growing skills, Alara felt the weight of their threat. She pressed her hand against the cool glass, her thoughts swirling. Behind her, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. She didn't need to turn to know it was Kale. His presence was as familiar to her now as her own shadow, a steady force that both grounded and unsettled her. They'll come again, she said softly, her voice barely audible over the storm. Kale came to stand beside her, his gaze fixed on the storm. Yes, and when they do, they'll bring more than scouts. Alara turned to him, her eyes searching his face. Are we ready? Kale's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away from the window. We will be. The council underestimates you. They think you're weak because you're human. Alara felt a flicker of anger at his words, not at Kale, but at the council's arrogance. Then we'll prove them wrong. Kale finally turned to her, his golden eyes intense. You're stronger than any of them realize, Alara. But strength isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing when to hold your ground and when to adapt. Alara nodded, his words sinking in. She had come a long way since stepping foot on the estate, but there was still so much to learn. She looked back at the storm, its raw power a reminder of the challenges ahead. I won't let them take this place, she said firmly. Or you. Kale's expression softened, and he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against her cheek. His touch was warm, a stark contrast to the cold glass beneath her hand. You won't face them alone, he said quietly. Whatever happens, we face it together. Alara leaned into his touch, her heart pounding. The storm outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the quiet intensity between them. Kale's hand slid from her cheek to her shoulder, his fingers tracing a slow, deliberate path. His gaze held hers, and for a moment, the weight of their bond felt almost tangible. Alara, he murmured, his voice a low rumble. She didn't reply, her breath hitching as he closed the distance between them. When his lips met hers, it was with a fierce, almost desperate intensity. Alara responded in kind, her hands gripping the front of his shirt as she lost herself in the kiss. The world around them melted away, leaving only the heat of his touch and the steady rhythm of their heartbeats. Kale pulled her closer, his hands moving to her waist as their kiss deepened. There was a rawness to the way they clung to each other, a shared understanding of the battles they had fought and those still to come. Alara's fingers tangled in his hair, her body pressing against his as their connection grew stronger. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Kale rested his forehead against hers, his hands still holding her as if afraid to let go. This bond, he said softly, his voice filled with emotion, it's more than I ever expected. Alara nodded, her eyes meeting his. It's everything. They stayed like that for a while, wrapped in each other's warmth as the storm continued to rage outside. Eventually, Kale stepped back, his hands lingering on her arms. Come, he said, his voice gentle. There's something we need to prepare. Alara followed him through the mansion, their footsteps echoing in the quiet halls. He led her to the armory, a room she had only seen once before. The walls were lined with weapons of every kind, from swords and daggers to bows and shields. Kale moved with purpose, selecting a few key items and laying them out on the central table. We'll need to strengthen the estate's defenses, he said, his tone all business now. The council will try to exploit any weakness. Alara nodded, picking up one of the daggers and testing its weight in her hand. Where do we start? Kale smiled, a hint of pride in his expression. We start by making sure they never see us coming. For the next few hours, they worked together to reinforce the estate. Kale showed Alara how to set traps around the perimeter, using the natural terrain to their advantage. They laid out a series of defensive strategies, each one designed to counter the council's likely tactics. Despite the serious nature of their task, Alara found herself enjoying the time spent with Kale. They moved in sync, their bond evident in the way they anticipated each other's actions. It was a reminder of how far they had come, not just as allies, but as partners. By the time they finished, the storm had begun to subside. The sky was still dark, but the rain had lessened, and the thunder had grown distant. Alara stood at the edge of the forest, looking out over the estate. The traps and defenses were in place, but more importantly, she felt ready. Kale came to stand beside her, his presence once again grounding. They'll come soon, he said, his voice low. But when they do, they won't find us unprepared. Alara nodded, her gaze steady. Let them come. Kale's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. Together, they stood in the fading storm, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The night was unnervingly quiet, the kind of stillness that set every nerve on edge. Alara stood on the mansion's balcony, her gaze fixed on the forest beyond. The defenses were in place, and she knew Kale was somewhere out there, patrolling the perimeter. But even with their preparations, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something they couldn't fully anticipate. A chill breeze swept through the trees, rustling the leaves and carrying with it a faint, unfamiliar scent. Alara's grip tightened on the dagger at her side. She had trained relentlessly for this moment, yet the anticipation of conflict left her heart racing. Behind her, the sound of footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor. She turned to see Kale stepping into the room, his expression grim but steady. His hair was damp from the night air, and his golden eyes glinted in the dim light. They're close, he said, his voice low and certain. Alara nodded, her pulse quickening. How many? Too many to count, Kale replied, his gaze meeting hers. But we've faced worse odds. Despite the tension, a small smile tugged at the corners of Alara's lips. Confident, are we? Kale stepped closer, his presence calming even in the face of danger. I've seen what you're capable of, Alara. Together, we're stronger than they realize. His words sent a warm surge through her, bolstering her resolve. She reached out, her hand brushing against his. Then let's remind them. Kale's fingers closed around hers briefly, a silent promise of unity. He stepped back, his focus shifting to the task at hand. Stay close to me. We'll draw them in, but we won't let them control the battlefield. Alara followed him as they descended the grand staircase and made their way to the mansion's main hall. The air grew heavier with each step, the weight of impending conflict settling over them. They stopped at the center of the room, their eyes scanning every shadow. The first sign of the enemy came in a sudden gust of wind, the torches flickering wildly. The doors rattled on their hinges before bursting open, revealing a group of shifters cloaked in darkness. Their eyes glowed in the faint light, their forms shifting subtly as they stepped inside. Kale moved in front of Alara, his claws already extending. "You've made a mistake coming here," he growled, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. The leader of the intruders, a tall figure with sharp, angular features, stepped forward. His smile was cold and calculating. "The council doesn't make mistakes," he said, his tone smooth but dripping with malice. "We're here to restore order." Alara stepped up beside Kale, her dagger gleaming in her hand. "Your idea of order doesn't belong here," she said firmly. "This estate is under my protection." The leader's gaze flicked to her, his smile widening. "Ah, the human error." Bold words for someone so fragile. Before Alara could respond, Kale lunged forward, his claws slashing through the air. The leader dodged with inhuman speed, his movements fluid and precise. The room erupted into chaos as the other shifters attacked, their growls and snarls echoing through the hall. Alara fought alongside Kale, her training guiding her every move. She ducked and weaved, her dagger striking with precision. The bond between her and Kale seemed to hum with energy, their movements perfectly synchronized. Each time a shifter closed in on her, Kale was there, his claws and strength creating a barrier they couldn't breach. The battle raged on, the mansion's grand hall bearing the marks of the conflict. Furniture splintered, and the walls shook with the force of their clashes. But Alara and Kale held their ground, their determination unwavering. At one point, Kale caught Alara's gaze, his eyes blazing with pride. "You're holding your own," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. Alara managed a breathless smile, her focus never wavering. "I told you I could fight." The leader of the intruders watched them with growing frustration. He barked an order, and the remaining shifters regrouped, their focus intensifying. They attacked with renewed ferocity, their strategy shifting to target Alara directly. Kale's growl deepened, his protective instincts surging. He moved with blinding speed, placing himself between Alara and their attackers. The bond between them pulsed with raw energy, strengthening their resolve. In a daring move, Alara used the chaos to her advantage. She sidestepped one of the shifters and delivered a precise strike to its side, sending it sprawling. The leader snarled, his calm facade cracking as he realized they were losing control. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice filled with venom. "The council will not be denied." Kale advanced on him, his claws gleaming in the dim light. "You'll regret ever setting foot here." The leader hesitated, his confidence faltering. He signaled to his remaining allies, and they began to retreat, their forms blending into the shadows. Within moments, the hall fell silent once more, the intruders gone. Alara lowered her dagger, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. The adrenaline still coursed through her veins, but relief quickly followed. They had won for now. Kale turned to her, his expression a mix of pride and concern. "Are you hurt?" Alara shook her head, her hand resting briefly on his arm. "I'm fine, thanks to you." Kale's gaze softened, and he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against her cheek. "You were incredible," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You've proven you're more than capable." Alara felt a warmth spread through her at his words. She placed her hand over his, their bond solid and unbreakable. "We did this together." Kale nodded, a rare smile gracing his features. "And together, we'll face whatever comes next." They stood in the quiet aftermath of the battle, the storm outside now a distant memory. The mansion bore the scars of the conflict, but its heart, its protectors, remained strong. Alara knew the council wouldn't give up easily, but she also knew they had something the enemy couldn't break. With Kale by her side, she was ready for whatever lay ahead. The sun barely crested the horizon when Alara and Kale set out. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. The council had issued an ultimatum, a summons to their stronghold deep within the forest, where the final confrontation would take place. Refusing was not an option. Alara's claim to the estate, and to Kale, would be decided once and for all. Alara walked beside Kale, her steps steady despite the weight of what lay ahead. She had dressed in practical gear, her dagger strapped securely to her side. Kale was in his hybrid form, his beastly features accentuated by the morning light. His golden eyes scanned the path ahead, every sense alert. "You don't have to do this," Kale said quietly, breaking the silence. "They'll challenge your right to me. Your place is heir. It won't be easy." Alara glanced at him, her expression resolute. "I've come too far to back down now. This isn't just about the estate or the pact. It's about us." Kale's gaze softened, and he gave a small nod. Then we faced them together. The journey to the council's stronghold was long, the dense forest giving way to rugged terrain. As they approached, the trees thinned, revealing a massive stone structure carved into the side of a mountain. The architecture was ancient, its towering spires and intricate carvings a testament to the shifter's long history. Alara felt a chill run down her spine as they crossed the threshold. The interior of the stronghold was vast and imposing, lit by flickering torches that cast long shadows on the walls. At the center of the grand hall stood a circular platform, its edges adorned with symbols that pulsed faintly. The council members were already there, seated in a semicircle on raised stone thrones. Each of them bore the unmistakable traits of their beast forms: sharp eyes, pointed ears, and a palpable aura of power. The leader, the same man who had sent scouts to the estate, stood as they entered. His presence was commanding, his eyes cold and calculating. He gestured for them to step onto the platform. "Kale, bound guardian of the estate," the leader said, his voice echoing through the hall. "You and your human heir have defied the council's authority. Today, your bond will be tested." Alara stepped forward, her chin held high. "We've done nothing wrong. The pact was passed to me, as it should have been." The leader's gaze shifted to her, his expression one of disdain. "A human claiming such power is an affront to our kind. If you wish to keep your claim, you will prove your worth." Kale growled low in his throat, his claws flexing. "She has nothing to prove to you." The leader raised a hand, silencing the murmurs from the other council members. "Then let the trial begin." The platform beneath them shifted, the symbols glowing brighter as the air grew heavy with energy. Alara felt a strange pull, as if the very ground was testing her resolve. A shimmering barrier rose around the platform, isolating them from the rest of the hall. "The trial is simple," the leader said. "Survive." Without warning, the symbols on the platform flared, and shadowy figures began to materialize. They took the form of beasts, their eyes glowing red as they lunged toward Alara and Kale. Kale reacted instantly, his claws slashing through the nearest shadow beast. Alara moved in sync with him, her dagger slicing through another. Despite their spectral forms, the beasts fought with terrifying force, their claws and fangs striking with precision. Alara's heart pounded as she dodged and countered, her training with Kale guiding her every move. The bond between them pulsed with energy, their connection strengthening with each shared glance and coordinated attack. They fought as one, their movements fluid and precise. But the beasts kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. For every one they defeated, two more took its place. Alara's muscles burned, her breaths coming in short gasps, but she refused to give in. She could feel Kale's presence beside her, his strength and determination bolstering her own. As the battle raged on, the leader's voice echoed through the chamber. "Your bond is strong, but strength alone will not save you. Prove your unity." Alara and Kale exchanged a glance, understanding passing between them without words. They shifted their tactics, focusing not on defeating the beasts, but on protecting each other. Kale shielded Alara from a devastating blow, his body absorbing the impact, while Alara struck a critical hit that dispersed several beasts at once. The platform pulsed with energy, reacting to their efforts. The bond between them grew stronger, a bright thread of light connecting their hearts. The beasts began to falter, their forms flickering as the energy of the platform shifted. Finally, with one last coordinated strike, Alara and Kale drove the remaining beasts back. The shadowy figures dissolved into mist, and the platform's glow faded. The barrier around them lowered, leaving them standing side by side, victorious. The hall was silent, the council members watching with unreadable expressions. The leader stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Alara. "You have proven your bond," he said reluctantly. "The pact recognizes your claim." Alara straightened, her chin held high. "Then we're done here." The leader's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "For now. But remember this, the council's watch is eternal. Protect your bond, for it is your only defense." Kale growled low in his throat, but he said nothing as he and Alara turned to leave. Together, they walked out of the stronghold, their steps steady and confident. As they emerged into the open air, Alara felt a wave of relief wash over her. The trial was over, and they had proven their strength. She looked up at Kale, his golden eyes softening as they met hers. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. Kale placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding. "We did it together." Alara smiled, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. The bond between them was unbreakable, a force that would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The walk back to the estate was quiet, the tension of the trial slowly giving way to a sense of accomplishment. The forest around them was alive with the sounds of nature, birds calling to one another, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive atmosphere of the council's stronghold. Alara felt a weight lift from her chest with every step, though the gravity of what they had faced lingered. Kale walked beside her, his presence as steady and reassuring as ever. His hybrid form had receded, leaving him in his more human guise, though his golden eyes still carried a feral edge. He glanced at her now and then, his expression unreadable, as if gauging her thoughts. "You were incredible back there," Kale said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet but filled with sincerity. "You stood your ground, even when they tried to break you." Alara glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I couldn't have done it without you." Kale's gaze softened, and he nodded. "We're stronger together." They reached the edge of the estate just as the sun began to set, casting the grounds in a warm, golden light. The mansion stood tall and imposing, but it no longer felt like a place of mystery and isolation. It was home now, a sanctuary they had fought to protect. Inside, the air was warm and welcoming. Alara headed to the grand hall, where the faint scent of wood smoke lingered from the fireplace. She sank into one of the armchairs, her body finally relaxing. Kale followed, standing near the hearth as he stoked the fire. For a while, neither of them spoke. The quiet was comfortable, a moment to reflect on what they had accomplished. Alara watched the flames dance, her thoughts drifting. "We've come a long way," she said softly, breaking the silence. "When I first arrived here, I never imagined things would turn out like this." Kale turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "You've changed, Alara. You've grown stronger, more confident. You're not the same person who walked through those doors." Alara looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. "Neither are you." Kale's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Maybe not." He crossed the room, his movements deliberate but unhurried, and sat on the edge of the chair opposite hers. His gaze held hers, an unspoken question lingering in the air between them. "I've been thinking about the bond," Kale said quietly. "What it means for us." Alara's heart skipped a beat. She straightened in her seat, her pulse quickening. And Kale leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "It's more than just a connection. It's a partnership, a promise. We're stronger together because we trust each other, because we've chosen to stand by each other." Alara nodded, her throat tightening. I know. I feel it too. Kale reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the armrest. His touch was warm, grounding. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Alara's fingers curled around his, a surge of emotion washing over her. Together. They sat like that for a while, the quiet intimacy of the moment speaking louder than words. The bond between them pulsed gently, a reminder of the strength they drew from each other. Eventually, Kale stood, pulling Alara to her feet. Come with me, he said, his voice soft but commanding. Curious, Alara followed him through the mansion. He led her to a part of the estate she hadn't explored yet, a small courtyard tucked away behind the main building. It was peaceful here, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers. A stone bench sat in the center, surrounded by a low hedge. Kale gestured for her to sit, and she did, her eyes scanning the tranquil space. He remained standing, his gaze thoughtful as he looked out over the courtyard. This place was important to Lyra, Kale said after a moment. She came here when she needed to think, to find clarity. Alara's chest tightened at the mention of her cousin. She hadn't known Lyra well, but she felt a deep connection to her through the legacy she had left behind. It's beautiful, Alara said softly. Peaceful. Kale nodded. I thought it might help you to reflect on everything we've been through. Alara looked up at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you, Kale, for everything. Kale's gaze softened, and he sat beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers. You don't have to thank me, he said quietly. We're in this together. Alara leaned into him slightly, the warmth of his presence a comfort. They sat in silence, the peace of the courtyard enveloping them. The challenges they had faced, the battles they had fought, all of it had led to this moment, a quiet reprieve in the midst of chaos. As the sky darkened, the first stars appearing overhead, Alara felt a sense of calm settle over her. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt truly prepared to face it. With Kale by her side, she was ready for whatever the future held. Kale turned to her, his golden eyes reflecting the starlight. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. Alara nodded, her hand finding his once more. Together, she whispered, her voice filled with quiet determination. The night stretched on, the bond between them unbreakable as they prepared for the next chapter of their journey. The days following their return from the council's stronghold were marked by a quiet sense of renewal. The estate, once a place of uncertainty and burden, now felt like a sanctuary. Alara and Kale worked tirelessly to restore the damage from the battles, their efforts transforming the mansion into a home that reflected their shared determination and bond. The early morning light streamed through the tall windows of the study as Alara stood by the desk, sorting through the ancient texts that had once intimidated her. Now they felt like allies, holding secrets that could strengthen her role as the estate's guardian. She had grown accustomed to the weight of responsibility, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it was a purpose she had embraced. Kale entered the room quietly, his presence immediately filling the space. He carried a wooden box, its surface carved with intricate designs that matched the symbols etched into the estate's walls. Alara looked up, her curiosity piqued. What's that? She asked, setting down the book in her hands. Kale placed the box on the desk and opened it, revealing a pendant crafted from silver and dark stone. It was simple yet elegant, the design mirroring the markings of their bond. He picked it up, the pendant catching the light as it swayed gently. This was Lyra's, Kale said, his voice soft. She wore it as a symbol of her connection to the estate and to me. It's only fitting that it passes to you now. Alara's throat tightened as she reached out to take the pendant. The metal was cool against her skin, but it seemed to hum with a quiet energy. It's beautiful, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. Kale stepped closer, his gaze steady as he watched her. You've earned it, he said. You've proven yourself in every way. Alara felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. She turned, lifting her hair as she fastened the pendant around her neck. When she faced Kale again, his eyes lingered on the pendant for a moment before meeting hers. "It suits you," he said, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Alara smiled back, a sense of pride and belonging settling over her. She reached out, her fingers brushing against Kale's hand. "We've come a long way," she said softly. Kale nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We have, and there's still more to do." They spent the rest of the morning walking the estate grounds, checking the defenses, and ensuring everything was in order. The forest around them was alive with the sounds of nature, a reminder of the life they were fighting to protect. Alara felt a deep connection to the land, as if it were an extension of herself. As they reached the edge of the property, Kale paused, his gaze scanning the horizon. "The council will be watching," he said. "They'll wait for any sign of weakness." Alara stepped beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Then we won't give them one." Kale turned to her, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "No, we won't." That evening, the estate was bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Alara and Kale stood on the balcony, watching as the sky shifted from gold to deep blue. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of the forest. Alara leaned against the railing, her thoughts drifting. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. "What we'll do once things settle down?" Kale leaned beside her, his arms resting on the railing. "There's always going to be something to protect," he said. "But we'll face it together, whatever it is." Alara nodded, a sense of peace washing over her. "I like the sound of that." Kale glanced at her, his golden eyes softening. "You've changed, Alara. When you first arrived, you were unsure, hesitant. But now," he paused, his gaze unwavering. "Now, you're a force to be reckoned with." Alara felt a flush of warmth at his words. She met his gaze, her heart swelling with gratitude and something deeper. "I had a good partner." Kale reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek. His touch was gentle, a contrast to the strength she knew he carried. "You're more than that," he said quietly. Alara's breath caught, the world around them fading as she focused on Kale. Their bond pulsed between them, a steady rhythm that spoke of trust and connection. Kale leaned in slowly, his lips brushing against hers in a soft, deliberate kiss. The moment stretched, their connection deepening as they held each other. When they finally pulled apart, Alara rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed as she savored the closeness. "We've got this," she whispered. Kale smiled, his hand slipping to the back of her neck. "We do." They stayed on the balcony until the stars filled the sky, their presence a silent witness to the bond that had grown between them. The challenges they had faced had forged a connection that was unbreakable, a partnership built on trust, strength, and love. As the night deepened, Alara and Kale returned to the warmth of the mansion, ready to face whatever the future held. Together, they were unstoppable. Together, they were home.